What's up, gangsters? It is another fine spring afternoon at Rube Goldberg Enterprises. And it is time for what was going to be another 10 minutes of technique video. But in typical long-winded fashion, I bit off more than I could chew. I tried to cover too much stuff, and it ended up being more like 30 minutes of technique. So, anyway, I think it's just going to be that. Anyway, this video is about doing panel lines on aircraft. And I tried to cover the basics of the way that I do it. And I use some different materials in different situations. I've been experimenting with a new technique. So I tried to include all of that, and anyway, so it's a little longer than I anticipated, but hopefully you guys will like it, and it will be useful. So, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to do some technique here, but first, some generalities about washes, because I know these questions will come up. The first thing is gloss or matte surface. You will see this question come up a lot, and there are plenty of people who will insist that you must use a gloss finish to do your washes successfully. And this is simply not true. It really depends on the effect that you're after. If you have a gloss finish, the washes are going to flow faster, they're going to stay tighter, and they're going to produce a certain kind of effect, which is great if that's what you want. Like for example, I am trying to do some hard black panel lining around these gear doors, and I don't really want any staining, so the gloss finish is really good for that. Now this happens to just be MRP's native sheen, but you can see that it is pretty glossy. It's rare that I'm going to actually put down a gloss coat specifically for the purposes of doing washes. I won't say never, but it is definitely rare. This level of sheen is plenty glossy enough. Now, if you want to do it on a matte surface, the reason for that would be because you want to create some staining effects around whatever it is you're putting the wash on. And a good example is this right here. I've already done the wings on this kit, and what I wanted around these engine access panels was kind of some dirty, filthy smudges around all of those Zeus fasteners. So I wanted to do the wash on a flat finish because it has a tendency to bleed and spread out a lot when you do that. Now, some people will say, well, isn't it harder to clean up if you're doing it on a flat finish? And the answer is, not really, not so much. And I'm going to demonstrate that here in a second. Let me just get out some of this Tamia panel line accent color, and I'm going to just put a little bit of it on this thing here, which has, at this point, had everything sealed in with dull coat. So it's pretty flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put a little drop of that right there. Okay. Now you can see what I mean about it spreading out. It instantly started to kind of bleed out rather than just sitting there in a little pile. And we're going to talk about those washes again here in a second. But anyway, so you can see. All right, so I'm going to let that sit there and dry while I rattle on about what we might use to make the washes once we decide what effect we're after and what sort of finish we're working on. There's a number of options. One is the simple sludge wash, where you use something like a clay wash from UMP. These are great. They're water-based. And the basic method is that you apply it all over the whole thing, let it dry, and then wipe it off. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. The next option you can do are You can mix inks with things like Future and make washes that will do interesting things. You can mix this Indian ink with alcohol and make washes that will do interesting things. But again, not going to talk about that today. There are also acrylic washes that are available. And some people like them. I personally would never recommend using them because they're just harder to shift once they're dry. And part of what you want to be able to do with washes is obviously clean up the excess and sort of tailor the look after the thing has dried, and acrylics just make that tougher, especially if you use them on top of acrylic paint, which is very often the case with us as military modelers. So what I'm going to focus on is washes that are mineral spirits based, because they don't interact with an acrylic undercoat, and the same thing really with lacquers, which is what all of this work is on this B25. And so because they flow so well and they're so easy to clean up, enamel washes, which are pretty much always going to be mineral spirits based, are always going to be my preference, just like 95 out of 100 times. Now, within that category, you have some various options. One of my favorites is the ammo panel line washes. These are really nice because when you apply them, they dry pretty quickly and they're easy to remove when they're dry. You can just basically wipe them off. You don't have to introduce any thinner to speak of at all. And I'll just show you that. I want to create some darker rivets in the area right here of where this exhaust stain travels across this vertical stabilizer. So it's pretty simple with these washes. Often it's a good idea to take some out of the jar and put them in a cup because they have a tendency to settle pretty fast. You have to keep them stirred up and shaken. I mean, literally like every couple of minutes. But this is going to be quick, so I think I'll be okay. So, I mean, the simple thing is you just apply it where you want it. I don't want it to go all the way up this surface, just part of the way. And I've already done the deep panel lines here with a different wash, which I'll show you here in a second. So that's why I'm not really worried about that. Right now I'm just trying to collect the rivets mostly. So it's that simple. And I'll do the other side here real quick, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so these are really nice. They're super easy to use, and they come in a bunch of colors that are really good for military models. So that's one reason I like them. Another thing that I like a lot are the Tamia panel line washes that I mentioned. They unfortunately only come in a couple of colors. They are a little bit different. They're mineral spirits based, just like the other stuff is. But for whatever reason, these things stick a lot harder. And you pretty much will have to use some mineral spirits to do the cleanup, which I'll show you. But these are nice because they have real high density. And I like to use the black in particular for what I call functional panel lines. So that's things like the hinge joint on an aircraft control surface, access panels like this where I want to show that it's removable. Things like gaps between those cowl flaps. Those are the kind of places where I use the hard black, and you can see the differences here. I am not a fan of using hard black on an entire model because I just don't think that it looks that great or is very realistic. Another color of the Tamia that I like a lot is this dark brown one. It works good to kind of create some varying types of stains and just give you a different shade. It also works well as a mixer, as you'll see, with oils. And any of these Tamia panel line washes, or really any of these MIG panel line washes, can be used in the same way with oils. Now, the other thing is the other method that you can use, if you can't find the color that you want with the MIG or the Tamia or whatever, is you can use oils and mix your own. So that's what I've been doing for the panel lines on the let's call them the non-functional panel lines on this Mitchell, where I'm working in olive drab. I want a darker green than is on all of that's on all of the painted surface. But I haven't really found an oil that straight out of the tube is a good olive green. So what I'm using is this Winsor Newton olive green, which isn't bad. It's a little bit bright, as you can kind of see here, where I've got it squeezed out in this little tub. You can see it's a little bit brighter green, but that's not a big deal because it's so easy to mix. And this is the great thing about using straight oils for a panel line wash, is that you've got infinite control over the shades that you get and the consistency. And so what I do is a lot of times I'll just, if I need a lot, I'll just add some mineral spirits directly in here. Just like that. And just drag some of the oil over into it and start mixing it up. And you can kind of tell when it reaches the right consistency to start to flow. If it doesn't flow, it's a little too dense, and that might work for you. But if you're doing panel lines, you want it to wick along the surfaces with capillary action, so you need for it to flow. And you can kind of tell when it starts to do that. And you can see what I mean about this one just being kind of too bright of a green when you look at it there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some of this Tamia dark brown. That's been working pretty well for me. And that's a simple thing of just grabbing a little bit of it on the brush and just adding it in there. And this is, there's no obviously it's not precise. It's just by eye and to get whatever flavor it is that you're after. So I'm trying to speed this up a little bit. This is a little too thick still. I can see that it's not really flowing the way I want it to. So what I can do is just go dip into the mineral spirits and get a little bit more in my brush. And once I start to load it up and start actually applying it, then I can tell kind of how it's going to behave. So I'll just start right here. And you can see that it's wicking, but not really fast. It's still leaving a kind of just a dollop there, and it's not really flowing quite as much as I want. So I'll get a little bit more mineral spirits. It's also a little brown right there where I applied it. And now with a little bit more mineral spirits, it flows out a little bit better. Well, I say that. But at any rate, you can see that the process there is simply just of working your way along. And I've been pretty sloppy here, and that's not too big of a deal. But what I have found is the worst chore of all with panel line washing is removing it later. And this is where things start to get frustrating because you do all this work, you spend all this time to fill in all these panel lines, and then you come back and you start to do the removal of the excess, and you find that you're pulling it out of the recesses that you're trying to fill. And I'm gonna talk about removal here in a second. That's a lot of cleanup work, and the more of it you have to do, the more of a chance you stand of screwing up the work that you've done already. And so that's why even with the Tamia panel line washes, I use this Lowe and Cornell number 2 Ultra Round for doing most of the work, because it gives you a lot more control. I mean, when you look at that sharp point on that brush, you can see why. And what I'm trying to say here is that the best way to do the cleanup on these panel line washes is to not have to. So, and this is why I tend not to do sludge washes, although the next technique I'm going to show you is a lot like sludge washes, because I like to work as precisely as possible so that I have the least amount of cleanup to do. And you can see it's a long, slow, tedious process, but this is when the model really starts to come to life for me, so I don't mind it. It's just something that's kind of relaxing, and you just work on it, a little bit at a time and get it done. Anyway, so that's the 3 basic ways of doing an enamel panel line wash. Each of them, the Tamia panel line wash, the MIG panel line wash, or mixing your own with oils. They each kind of have their reason for being. I'm not going to try and explain all of how I decide which one to use, but obviously a lot of it depends on color and how difficult it's going to be to apply. For example, one of the reasons why I used the MIG stuff in this exhaust stain is because I already know that this exhaust stain, even though it's MRP lacquer, is relatively delicate. And if I do a bunch of scrubbing here with any amount of mineral spirits, it's gonna possibly screw that up. And so I like the MIG stuff because I know that I can wipe it off dry. Maybe it's even dry enough over here on this side where I can go ahead and do that. Not quite. But anyway, that's why I chose the MIG stuff for that reason. Now, if I do need to use the Tamia stuff, like on these hinges and access panels, this is the thing that it took me a while to learn, and this is what screws a lot of people up, is getting a rag and putting mineral spirits on it, or getting a Q-tip and soaking it in mineral spirits, and then starting to wipe off the excess, and getting frustrated because you're removing stuff that's down in the panel lines that you want to keep. And I really had to over-exaggerate how little mineral spirits I was using. And this is really the key. I just barely touch the Q-tip in the mineral spirits, and you can see how little I've got on there, maybe. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to wick a bunch of that off on this paper towel. And sometimes I'll even let the Q-tip sit for a while and let some of that mineral spirits kind of evaporate and clean itself out. Now, once I've done that and I'm ready to use the Q-tip, then it's really just all about having a really light touch and hopefully not having to do a lot of scrubbing. And you can see that you shouldn't have to. This Tamia panel line wash that I'm removing right now, I applied 3 days ago, I think. Today's Monday. I think I did it on Friday. Pretty sure that's right. And you can see it comes right off. should not require much effort at all, especially if you are working on a relatively shiny surface. Okay, now what if I'm not working on a shiny surface? What if I'm working on the dreaded matte surface where it's allegedly impossible to remove a Tamia panel line wash? So there we can see, I mean, that's good. That's the effect that I want on those control surfaces. And you can see, came right off, no problemo, no big deal. And I've got to do the same thing, obviously, on those gear doors. But anyway, let's go back to where I put the Tamia panel line wash right there on that little stain. You can see now that it's totally dry. All right. And got my Q-tip, and I'm going to just very gently, no, not even scrubbing at all, just very gently. And just like that. I mean, you can still see a little bit of an effect there, but that's just the mineral spirits that's not totally dried out there yet. Point is, panel line wash easily and completely cleaned off of a totally matte surface. So hopefully that goes a long way to dispel that myth. Now I want to show you guys another technique that I've been using, and this thing is running long, but oh well. And this is something that I saw David Damick doing. And he's the Plasmo guy of YouTube fame. Dude has like 1 million viewers or something, I don't know. And his videos are cool because he does the techniques kind of, fast motion. And it's kind of mesmerizing, and his work is really nice. And one thing I noticed him doing was using oils straight out of the tube and just rubbing them all over the work surface. Basically just like this, and then once he had all the panel lines done that he wanted, then he just took a rag and scrubbed it off. And I was like, hey, that is not only a pretty cool effect, but it looks like it's a little bit more efficient and effective than using the liquid panel line. So you can see I've mixed some kind of a darker medium gray here that I want, and I'm gonna just start doing that. I'm gonna just start scrubbing that on there. Now this is one thing that I really like about this, where I feel like it's more effective than the liquid methods, is that I can adjust the tone of this as I go. If I feel like that's a little too dark or a little too light, all I got to do is go back, get a little bit of my blend colors on, so get a little bit of white. Come on, get a little bit of white on my Q-tip, and I can add that in, and I can start mixing it, and I have infinite control, just like I do when I mix these washes with mineral spirits from oil paints. I have infinite control, but this way it's really on the fly. I can do it as I'm working, and I can control it real tightly. If I wanted to be just a little darker only right here, no big deal. I can adjust that locally. And that's what I did. I will show you here on the bottom of these horizontal stabilizers. Over here where this exhaust stain has darkened the paint, I want those rivets to be blacker than I do over here on the inboard part of the stabilizer. So what I did is I mixed it up a pretty dark shade, and I smeared that around over here, and then I added some white to lighten it up as I smeared it around over here. Then when I went and wiped it off, and what I use is just a kind of a rough paper towel. You don't want to use a soft paper towel because it will pull more material out of the recesses. But it's just a matter of wiping it off, and you have to switch up the area of your paper towel pretty often. But you can see it starts to come off pretty easy. And by the time you get it pretty much all removed, you can just kind of burnish the crap out of it. And you can see now I don't have hardly any more coming off on the paper towel. And you can see I have a nice, subtle, darker gray panel line and rivet detail there. That's really nice. Makes it easy to get those complementary colors and to vary up the shades quite a bit. Now, you probably are already asking, well, if this is straight oil out of the tube, what about dry time? Especially given that it's a little bit thicker and more opaque in those panel lines, which is part of the reason that I like this method. Yeah, you do need to give it a little bit of dry time, but overnight should be fine. Like these have been overnight, and I'm going to seal them in. Well, if I were done with the whole thing, I would be sealing them in with dull coat after 24 hours. And that's what I did on the bottoms of these wings. Obviously, it can be a little bit of a challenge if you've got things like insignia or a color break like I do right here, you know, because you have to be careful, obviously, of crossing the lines and getting color where you don't want it. But when you've got an entire surface that you can really just scrub all over without any penalty, it can work out really good. And you can see that I've varied the tone all the way across this wing surface, where I've got a little darker back towards the control surface where there's a lot of grime. Over here next to the engines, it's a little bit darker, but I lightened it a little bit just within those letters so that those rivets would show a little bit better. And you can see how nice that effect is. I can achieve any degree of subtlety that I want with the toning of the panel lines. Now, I didn't do it here on top for a couple of reasons. One, because getting the tone correct was a little bit more of a challenge with the green that I had, but also because there just wasn't as much that I needed to do with just a few panel lines, so it wasn't really that much work to do it the other way. I actually did use the I don't know what I should call this method. I called it the spooge and rub method on Scale Modeler's Critique Group, and that drew all kinds of jokes, so probably won't go with that name. But at any rate, just using the straight oils was good in an area like this where it was obviously had a lot of filth that was built up. So at any rate, there you go. Now, to go back to this area where I used the ammo panel line washes, that looks like it's dry now, and let me just go ahead and remove that, and you can see how easily that stuff comes right off. And there we go. I've got some darkening of the rivets in just that area, and a super nice tonality going on there to reflect that exhaust stain. So good stuff, and all stuff that's super easy to do, and I believe adds a really important level of realism and artistic style to your work. So there you go. Okay, so like I said, a little longer than I expected it to be, but you know, that happens. At any rate, I hope that was useful. I hope that gives you some ideas about panel lining beyond the basics. I mean, I feel like a lot of us feel like it's, you know, basic modeling skills, and don't ever really give a whole lot of thought to it beyond that. But as you can see, there is another level that you can take it to, and that's what this is all about, at least for me. So anyway, if you watched this much, I definitely appreciate it, and as always, much love.